Chapter 14, Resurrection, in which the flashback ends with the miraculous return of the Grasshopper to resume discussion with his disciples, who have utterly failed to solve the riddles he left them when he died. Skepticus. Prudence, it is now mid-November. We have pondered the Grasshopper's deathbed riddles in the light of his theory of games for more than a fortnight, and yet we seem no closer to a solution than ever. So I think we shall have to abandon the game we so eagerly anticipated playing, for evidently we cannot even begin it. We might as well have been trying to play tennis with a 200-pound tennis ball. Prudence. I'm afraid I must agree with you, Skepticus. I feel as helpless and as stupid as Dr. Watson after Holmes has given him all the clues and then sits back with a superior smirk at his friend's blank countenance. Quite so, for even knowing what a game is, or at least knowing what the Grasshopper believes a game to be, seems to have no bearing whatever on the Grasshopper's apparent conviction that the life of the Grasshopper must be a life devoted to game playing rather than to trombone playing, or to intellectual inquiry, or to love. For surely these things enjoy as much autonomy as does the playing of games. Why must a life freed from the necessity to work be identical with a life dedicated to games? That is the question precisely. If only the Grasshopper were here, there are some objections I could put to him, and then perhaps we could begin to see the direction of his thinking. There is a kind of soft scratching at the door. I'll get it, Prudence. He opens the door to find the Grasshopper wearing an air of some bewilderment standing on the stoop. My God, Prudence, it's the Grasshopper! Prudence rushes to the door. Grasshopper, you're alive! Grasshopper. Evidently. Come in and sit down. You look quite dazed. Thank you, Prudence. I do feel a bit giddy. But what happened? How do you account for your resurrection? I don't suppose one does account for miracles, does one, since they are unaccountable occurrences. Still, we may take note of the fact that there is in progress an unusually fine Indian summer, so my presence among the living should perhaps be regarded as more a stay of execution than an outright reprieve. But how did it happen? I hardly know. I remember bidding you and Skepticus farewell, and then oblivion, until about a half an hour ago. And what happened half an hour ago, Grasshopper? Why, of all things, I found myself seated in a grandstand, watching a cricket match. A cricket match? Yes, the football was on the 50-yard line. Grasshopper, I'm afraid you're a bit addled. Were you watching a football match or a cricket match? Give your head a good shake. It will help to clear your mind. I have no intention of giving my head a good shake. My mind is quite clear, thank you. But you were never any good at riddles, I now remember, so let me explain. 1. The game I was watching was football. 2. The players on the two teams were crickets. 3. I repeat that I was watching a cricket match, and the football was on the 50-yard line. So, you were resurrected into a pun. That's rather funny. Only faintly so, and such a level of humor, I must say, is just what one might expect of an agency which found it amusing to perform a resurrection in the first place. A riddle's turning on an obvious pun is just about as witty as the practical joke of resurrecting the dead. And do you really believe, Grasshopper, that there is some agency which controls our destinies? More specifically, I believe that there is some author who writes our dialogue. Why do you say that? Well, he has given himself away twice already, hasn't he? How on earth could Skepticus here have been admitted to Huishaika's consulting room? Yes, that was odd, as I believe I remarked at the time. Odd. It is impossible outside of fantasy fiction. And what about my resurrection? How many people get resurrected these days? But why do you suppose he tipped his hand? The arrogance of power. He can afford to tip his hand because he holds all the cards, and he has, as we have noticed, a fairly primitive sense of humor, so that he thinks it clever to jump up first, second, and even third-order narrative levels, as of course he is doing right now, in having me say the things about him that I am saying. Hold on, Grasshopper, you are giving me an attack of vertigo. Not vertigo, Skepticus, but that other Latin form of dizziness. What is that? Pirandello. Ah, the feeling is passing. What? Oh, yes, Prudence, thank you. Neat, please, with just a little ice. What were you saying, Grasshopper? Just that you were suffering a mild attack of Pirandello, but I see that you have recovered. Yes, I have. Now, Grasshopper, let me see if I understand you. You seem to be saying that this author you speak of is playing some kind of game with us? If you mean that he is trifling with us, then I agree that he is to some degree doing that. But whether he is playing a game and with whom is quite a different question. But do you think he is playing a game, Grasshopper? I think he may be, although it is perfectly possible that he is not. That's highly illuminating. Skepticus, why do you say that, Grasshopper? We have noticed that our author sometimes tips his hand, so we must ask ourselves what this hand is that he tips. What, that is to say, is he up to? And what do you think he is up to? I think he is writing a treatise on the philosophy of games. Brilliant, Grasshopper. Elementary, my dear Prudence. Assuming that there really is such an author, I must admit that your hypothesis does fit all the facts. But how does a game, which he may or may not be playing, come into the picture? Well, if he is writing the kind of treatise I have suggested, why doesn't he simply argue his position in a straightforward manner, like other authors who produce philosophical works? Why introduce the fanciful complication of presenting his thesis through the mouths, or at least from between the mandibles, of 3 insects? And why add the burden of having to remain in more or less consistent, elusive touch with Aesop, Socrates, and the New Testament? Why do all that? And you are suggesting that his reason might be that he has created a game by imposing upon his philosophical enterprise a constitutive rule which requires him to express his arguments only within those literary constraints. Precisely. For he certainly has at his disposal simpler and more efficient means for cogent argumentation, most notably the use of unadorned syllogisms. So, his refusal to express himself in a plain expository style is perhaps no different in principle from someone's setting out to write an entire book without using the letter E. And if that is the kind of thing that our author is doing, he may even be competing with another author who is similarly engaged. Or he may be trying to win a bet, or he may be simply playing the game for the fun of it. On the other hand, of course, he may be doing nothing of the kind. The dramatic and elusive style of his presentation may serve a quite different purpose. He may believe that with that style his work will be likely to secure a larger and more profitable readership than it would without such literary embellishments. Or he may believe that even if his arguments do not convince, they may at least entertain. Again, he may incorrectly believe that the cogency of his arguments is inseparable from their dramatic and allegorical presentation. And do you believe, Grasshopper, that he is doing one of these latter things, or do you believe he is playing a game? I think there is some evidence to suggest he is not playing a game. Earlier, I surmised that he mixed up narrative levels from time to time simply because he found it amusing to do so, perhaps out of the sheer exuberance of power. For example, his representing Skepticus as talking to Heuschrecke. But now I realize that there may be a reason other than his own amusement for the literary liberties our author is sometimes inclined to take. Such behavior may be his way of conveying to the reader a message of the following kind. Please don't get the idea, dear reader, that I am playing some kind of game which requires me to convey my philosophical ideas always and only within a consistent narrative form. It is true that I prefer to do that, for I am trying to write a book which is not too boring to read, but the expression of my argument is of paramount importance to me, and if there should arise in the writing of it a conflict between the presentation of that argument and the narrative form in which I have chosen to express it, then it is the form which must give way, for I am entirely ready to disrupt the narrative form at will. Behold. And he proceeds to prove his point by having Skepticus walk into Heuschreica's consulting room. So, are you satisfied that he is not playing a game? No, Prudence, I am not. For it is equally possible, I should think, that his mixing up of narrative levels is simply a literary lapse on his part. Even the great Homer, as Horace reminds us, sometimes nods. And our author is no Homer. Therefore, since we cannot decide the issue either way, I suggest that we abandon these theological speculations and return to the matter at hand. I agree. Where were we? Well, let me think. Yes, by resurrecting me into the cricket pun. Our author has got us talking about riddles, no doubt for some philosophical or dramatic purpose of his own. Right, and speaking of riddles, Grasshopper, Prudence and I require your assistance on a much more difficult and important one than the riddle of the football-playing cricket teams. See, I told you so. But what riddle is that, Skepticus? Why, the riddle you bequeathed to us when you died. Surely you remember that. Ah, yes, to be sure. I was telling you about my dream in which everyone alive was an unconscious game player. That's right, Grasshopper. Please tell us at once the meaning of the dream. Gently does it, Prudence, gently does it. I'm not sure I know the meaning of the dream myself, for... Grasshopper, don't say that. I'm dying of curiosity. For as I was saying, I have been dead for several weeks, so perhaps my mind is not, after all, as clear as it might be. Still, if Skepticus will assist me by posing his usual acute questions, that will no doubt help to focus my thoughts and so render my mind once again the finely tuned analytical instrument we know it to be. Splendid, Grasshopper, splendid. Then let me begin by asking you to consider a proposition you earlier advanced as a basic principle of existence, namely, that the life of the grasshopper, that is, a life devoted to play, is the only justification there can be for work, so that if there were no need for work, we would simply spend all of our time at play. Yes, Skepticus, I recall making that claim. Good. Now consider, since you use the terms work and play as logical complements of that class of things which we may call intentional behavior, you evidently conclude that if an activity is not work, then it is play, and vice versa. But prima facie, at least, that is an unconvincing dichotomy. For example, passing the time of day with a colleague appears to be neither work nor play, and attempting to solve a crossword puzzle appears to be both work and play. As descriptions, therefore, the words work and play seem not to designate subsets of intentional behavior, which are either exclusively of one another or exhausted of the set which includes them. My dear fellow, that's extremely well put. I agree with everything you say. You do? Certainly. My conclusion, however, is not that I gave you poor descriptions of work and play, but that I did not give you descriptions at all. I was using the words work and play stipulatively rather than descriptively. I meant by work activity which is instrumentally valuable, and by play activity which is intrinsically valuable. What play really is, and indeed whether play is definable, other than stipulatively, at all, are questions that need not concern us now, although, as it happens, I do have definite views on the subject, as I believe I intimated to you, Skepticus, in connection with our consideration of the principle of reverse English. Perhaps time permitting, we can take up that topic on another occasion. I should like nothing better, Grasshopper. Good. But for now, it is clear, I take it, that by play I mean nothing more than all those activities which are intrinsically valuable to those who engage in them. Yes, I am delighted to hear you say that, for it clears up one difficulty. Now, here is another. I take it that the life of idleness, which you exemplify by being the grasshopper, and which you go about recommending to anyone who will listen to you, is a life devoted exclusively to intrinsically valuable activities? That is so. Then surely, Grasshopper, a life devoted to game playing cannot be identical with that life. For although game playing as you define it is an intrinsically valuable activity, it is certainly not the case that all intrinsically valuable activities are games. One may also value for their own sake such things as scratching an itch or listening to a Beethoven quartet, but their being intrinsically valuable does not make such things games. Once more, Skepticus, you are perfectly correct, and your questions have quite cleared my mind, so that I believe I can, with your continued interlocutory assistance, resolve those perplexities which my dying words occasioned. Unless, of course, you and Prudence would rather work out the answers for yourself. That would make a kind of game out of the task. Skepticus and Prudence exchanged despairing glances, for you would then voluntarily be eschewing superior means for getting the answers just in order to using your own wits toward that end. Death, I see, has not noticeably mellowed your sarcastic nature. Mellowed? I should think not. Dying was the most exasperating thing that has happened to me in my entire life. In any case, what about my proposal? And now that I think of it, we might add just one more limitation to make the game more interesting. What is it? A time limit, of course. What shall it be then? A day? A week? Skepticus, Prudence, what do you say? Thank you for making the offer, Grasshopper, but I think not. For a time limit, indelicate as it may be to bring it up, is not completely within our power to set. After all, you have died once already, and Indian summers have a habit of ending rather abruptly. Since you may die again at any time, I urge you to begin at once and tell us the solution. As I had reason to observe earlier on, the two of you are not quite grasshoppers yet. A true grasshopper would fairly have leapt at the opportunity to play a timed game, where the length of the game is kept from the players. But surely, Grasshopper, not at the risk of losing forever that knowledge which is alone capable of justifying his existence. Ah, Prudence. But it is part of the thesis that I shall presently expound to you, time permitting, as Skepticus, triumphing over my sensibilities, has pointed out, that a true grasshopper would sacrifice anything and everything to be playing games. In fact, however, a true grasshopper would not be risking loss of the knowledge to which you allude. A true grasshopper already knows what justifies his existence. For a true grasshopper, and this will mystify you further, Skepticus, already knows everything there is to know. But that is getting a bit ahead of the story. Grasshopper, the floor is yours. Please, for heaven's sake, begin. Yes, Grasshopper, please. Very well, my friends. I shall.